since 1987, a South Korean president has proposed a constitutional change. President Moon Jae-in's constitutional revision proposal is now at the National Assembly after it passed through the cabinet meeting this morning. All eyes are on whether this bill will indeed pass through Parliament, considering that many political parties have been strongly against it. Now, the proposal focuses on changing the current single 5-year presidential term to a maximum of 2 successive 4-year terms, while curtailing the president's power and decentralizing the government. And before we sit down with our reporters to talk more about this, let's first head over to Devin Whiting at the News Center for the latest headlines at this hour. Devin.
Hi, Jaein. South Korea's trade minister says Seoul has reached an agreement with Washington in principle on how the two sides will amend their free trade agreement. Korea has also secured a permanent exemption from America's new tariffs on steel. Kim Hye-sung reports.
Right after he reported to the cabinet, South Korea's Trade Minister Kim Hyun-jong held a press conference Monday to explain the results of the negotiations on the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement.
Uncertainty has been growing in the global market following the U.S. plan to impose sanctions on China, and the latest agreement has removed 2 of those uncertainties. 1, South Korea is exempt from the steel tariff. 2nd is the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement.
Kim, Seoul's appointment on trade talks said South Korea is the first country to receive an indefinite exemption from Washington's 25% steel tariff measures. Currently, 5 countries, including Canada and Mexico, plus the EU, received a temporary exemption from the U.S. import duties on steel and aluminum that went into effect last week. In exchange, the U.S. will introduce a steel import ceiling. South Korea's quota will be set at 2.68 million tons of steel exports a year, or 70% of its average annual shipments to the U.S. between 2015 to 2017. Seoul has also agreed to lift some of the regulations on the local auto sector, enabling U.S. automakers to ship to Korea up to 50,000 vehicles each, up from 25,000 previously. Tariffs imposed on Korean pickup trucks exported to the U.S. will be extended by 20 years to 2041. South Korea, on the other hand, secured revisions to the investor-state dispute settlement clause and other areas it has demanded since the start of the trade talks.
We defended the red line. There is no further opening of agricultural markets or mandatory use of U.S. auto parts.
In addition, the two sides agreed to improve the transparency of the trade dispute settlement process, which covers issues like anti-dumping duties. The tentative agreement comes less than 3 months since the first round of trade talks began in January. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin also described the agreement as an absolute win-win in an interview with Fox News Sunday local time. South Korea's trade ministry said working-level officials are ironing out the details so that Seoul and Washington can finalize their amendments to the 6-year-old trade deal soon. Kim Hye-sung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, on a 4-day official visit to the United Arab Emirates, held a bilateral summit with the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi on Sunday. The 2 leaders agreed to upgrade their relations to a special strategic partnership. Our chief Blue House correspondent Moon Kan-yang reports.
Abu Dhabi, signified in an array of stunning skyscrapers and endless sandy beaches, it's almost impossible to imagine that this was once nothing but wind-blown desert sand dunes. In just 30 years' time, the United Arab Emirates has undergone a profound transformation. South Korean President Moon Jae-in and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, took President Moon's first official visit to the Middle Eastern country to expand their horizon of cooperation.
UAE 방문을 정말 학수고대해 왔습니다. 그동안 양국의 특사들이 오갔습니다만 왕 선생님을 이렇게 직접 뵙고 또 양국 관계 발전을 위해서 협의를 할 수 있게 돼서 아주 기쁘게 생각합니다.
During their bilateral summit, the two sides reviewed their bilateral cooperation amidst volatile international situations.
As you may well know, Mr. President, the relationship between our 2 countries is already very strong and special, but I hope the 2 countries will not be satisfied and will endlessly study ways to further develop our relations.
thus coming to the conclusion to upgrade their bilateral ties to a special strategic partnership, which means a new type of forward-looking cooperation that can drive each other's growth and advancement beyond the horizon of material economic relations. National defense, healthcare, agriculture, space exploration, and even state-of-the-art technology for the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
저는 미래 산업에 대한 투자를 아끼지 않는 UAE의 지혜와 한국이 가진 정보통신 역량과 첨단 기술력이 합쳐질 때 지능정보화 시대를 양국이 선도해 나갈 수 있다고 믿습니다.
The South Korean president also put behind speculation of dispute between the two countries over a possible secret military deal reached under a former president back in 2009.
한국은 UAE에게 동아시아 최고의 협력 파트너이고 UAE는 한국에게 중동 지역 최고의 협력 파트너입니다. 지난 일로 양국은 오히려 더욱 신뢰하는 관계가 되었습니다.
A senior Blue House official said President Moon and Crown Prince Mohammed agreed that defense cooperation is the backbone of their current bilateral relations.
양국은 이제 아크 부대라는 이름처럼 병리를 내다보는 진정한 형제 국가가 될 것입니다.
That, a reference to the 130-strong South Korean contingent stationed in the UAE to help train the UAE military for combat.
The South Korean president's UAE visit shows that the Asian nation's deepening ties with the Gulf country. If the $20 billion nuclear power plant project was a key pillar of the 2009 South Korea-UAE strategic partnership, the two leaders have made clear at the core of the 2018 special strategic partnership is cooperation in defense. 문건영, Arirang News, Abu Dhabi.
In other news, Japan appears to feel left out of the work being done by South Korea and the U.S. to denuclearize North Korea. And ahead of the summit in May between U.S. President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, Tokyo has asked that Washington set out certain preconditions for those talks. Those are that the North abandon its mid-range missiles and that the talks resolve the issue of the Japanese nationals abducted by the regime in the 70s and 80s. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Japan appears to be on the sidelines as South Korea and the United States work hand-in-hand, planning their respective summits with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And while Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe took time over the weekend to meet with former U.S. President Barack Obama during his trip to the country, the Japanese government continues to lobby the Trump administration to ensure there are preconditions ahead of the U.S.-North Korea summit. The preconditions include a promise from Pyongyang to resolve the long-running abduction issue and to abandon their mid-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting Japan. Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono made the request in separate talks in Washington earlier this month with U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis and Mike Pompeo, CIA Director and President Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, and Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan. According to Japanese officials, a number of its citizens were abducted by North Korea in the 1970s and the 1980s, and they are seeking U.S. help in bringing them home. North Korea agreed with Japan in 2014 to reinvestigate the abductions, but the agreement quickly fell apart. However, Abe has more problems domestically, as protesters took to the streets of Tokyo over the weekend, demanding he resign amid a widening cronyism scandal. Hundreds of demonstrators turned out on Sunday, carrying banners which read, "Go to jail, Abe," with one sign even depicting Abe as a prisoner in a black and white striped uniform. The protests come amid claims Abe was involved in the sale of state-owned land at a huge discount to a nationalist school operator, which his wife also has ties to. The protesters also demonstrated against Abe's decision to revise the country's post-war pacifist constitution, as critics fear the revision could pave the way for the Japanese military to play a bigger role overseas. With the Inter-Korean summit set for the end of April and the U.S.-North Korea summit scheduled for some time in May, Japan finds itself less involved in East Asia issues, with Abe's ongoing domestic problems and his tanking approval ratings. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
The Blue House has submitted its proposal for the constitutional revision to the National Assembly just about an hour ago. Now, if it makes it through the parliamentary voting and is backed by the public in a referendum, then it would be the first time in 30 years for the Constitution of South Korea to be revised. Joining us today here in the studio is our Blue House correspondent Hwang Ho-jun and our National Assembly correspondent Kim Min-ji. It's good to have you guys here.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so even with President Moon Jae-in visiting the United Arab Emirates, he did sign it electronically over there, and it's now tossed over to the National Assembly. So where does the submitted bill go from here on now?
Well, the National Assembly or the President has the right to submit a bill to amend the Constitution. And after a bill is submitted to the National Assembly, it needs to, the President needs to make a public announcement, which has to last for 20 days.
Okay.
And during that time, the Parliament vote will be held within 60 days. Now, taking a look at this chart, Parliament can use that time to deliberate on the President's proposal or come up with its own proposal, as it hasn't done so yet. The due process for amendment requires the approval of 2/3 of sitting lawmakers. Then a referendum can be carried out within 30 days of vote. Now, this must be notified at least 18 days in advance. Then a majority of Koreans need to vote in favor of it in a referendum. Now, talks have been underway at the National Assembly with a special committee in place since early last year, but talks have been slow, with rival parties locking horns over when to hold the vote and how to change the power structure. Thus, the President put forward the government's proposal.
All right, so we know that President Moon Jae-in ordered today's submission last week, and the presidential office did outline the summary of this revision last week from Tuesday and Thursday, right? Through Thursday. So would you be able to give us a rundown of what the summary was about?
Absolutely. It is a handful, but starting last Tuesday, the Blue House briefed the media on the proposed new preamble to the Constitution and matters concerning the basic rights. Now, the current preamble, it underscores that the notion of the nation's democratic identity lies in the April 19th revolution of 1960. Now, that was the protest against the electoral corruption of the Lee Seung-man administration.
Right.
And it's important, but now the Moon administration is deciding to add other democratic movements to the nation's constitutional framework as well, which would include the Busan Masan protests of 1979, the Gwangju democratization movement of the following year, and the June 10th democracy movement of the late 1980s. Now, it's important for us to remember that President Moon Jae-in was formerly a human rights lawyer and also a leading figure of the pro-democratic movement of the late 80s. So all of this was definitely reflected in the new constitution bill, but it's also going to expand the scope of basic human rights. Until now, it was strictly to Korean citizens, but now it's going to expand it to all humankind.
Okay.
Now, that was Tuesday, and on Wednesday, the focus was on decentralization, giving more authority and autonomy to local governments. And a clause that would also allow the national capital to be changed through legislation was also included, and a fairly new concept called public ownership of land, which would allow the state to regulate and restrict any land use for public reasons and public concern. Now, going on to Thursday, that was also the day when the entirety of the Constitution bill was made public, but especially that day, the Blue House announced its proposed form of government, which was absolutely stood out the most. And the change in role of the president, the length of his or her in office, and a shift in the balance of power between the branches of government was definitely made that day
there
as well.
seems to be a lot of changes
Absolutely.
made to the revision bill. Now, let's try to break this down a little bit. I mean, to compare the government's intentions as well as reaction from the public, as well as the parliament. So first off, let's look at the most striking change, which is, like you said, the form of government. So we're going to see the president sitting in the office and a different limit, different time. Presidential term is going to be changed. Tell us more about that.
That's right. So 30 years ago, in 1987, when the Constitution was last revised, it strictly stipulated that the president's time in office is going to be 5 years with no possibility of re-election. Now, that stipulation was put because South Korea was just coming out from a very long period of military dictatorship.
Right.
But today, the Blue House is stressing that it's a different time and that that's exemplified by the so-called Candlelight Revolution and its culmination last year. And the Moon administration just keep focusing and keep saying that the people's capability to practice democracy, it's far beyond that politicians.
Term.
Exactly. And so that's why it's proposing a 4-year presidency term with being able to continue its presidency for another year. But it has to be consecutive years.
It seems more stable that way, you know.
It can be seen as that too. And but what's important right now that this new system is not going to be applied to President Moon Jae-in. Rather, it's going to be applied to his successor.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that the Blue House wanted to make sure. Exactly.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now, Minji, how are the political parties responding to these changes?
Well, opposition parties have been opposed to this system. They have been calling for a semi-presidential system where authority is shared between the president and the prime minister. Now, they have called for the need to scrap the presidential system because it's normally dubbed the imperialistic president because it's led to corruption. We saw the case last year involving President Park Geun-hye, former President Park Geun-hye. And now for the term, the main opposition Liberty says by extending it to 4 years, 2 term would mean 8 years. So extending it from the current 5 to 8 means more imperialistic powers. So the government, so while they're saying they're willing to negotiate on the exact years or the terms, they're calling for a semi-presidential system, and the prime minister should be recommended by the parliament and not nominated by the president.
So kind of going along with that, let's dive into the next category, which is decentralization. So we know that the current government is pushing very much for a decentralized nation. Now, the Blue House even previously mentioned they will pursue decentralizing the nation so that it will become close to a federal nation. And now that putting that into the Constitution is raising some eyebrows here.
Yes, and about that expression, the Blue House time and time again emphasized it's just an expression. But just to give you a little bit more additional information, the Seoul metropolitan area takes up only 12% of the nation's land, but more than half of the country's population, 50 million plus population, is living in the metropolitan area. It's home to 74% of the nation's top 1,000 companies and 80% of the top 20 universities. So you can see why the government is concerned about this situation. So to make sure a stable and more balanced development of all regions across the nation, that's why the current government is pushing for decentralization and giving more autonomy, more authority to local governments, including, which might sound shocking, but making it easier for the local governments to propose its own laws and set their own tax rates as well. And to also develop regions outside of Seoul, another notion that was actually stipulated is that the new constitution would be able to it says the legislation will be able to determine and define the capital of the country. And it will become necessary for it to relocate government functions or agencies like it did for the city of Sejong. And I'm sure you remember this was practiced or at least attempted during the Nomuyan administration in 2004, but it's something that the court ruled impossible because it's what it called a customary constitution, even though it wasn't necessarily stipulated in the constitution at that time.
So I guess the Moon administration is trying really hard to address this imbalance that exists between Seoul and the rest of the country, right? Now, at this point, we're again wondering, what do parties say about this?
Well, the conservative opposition are calling it a political show. They say centralization of power and allowing a change in capital is a way to win favorable votes ahead of the local elections. Now, on this part, even the Progressive Justice Party said while it welcomes the move, it's a matter that needs further discussion of Parliament and needs social consensus because there needs to be balanced development across regions. Another area of concern is that if local governments are given the power to decide their own organizational structure and operational system as well as fiscal autonomy, it could create authoritative local governments.
And also, Ho-jun, I know you mentioned this earlier, but what is this public ownership of land. I mean, tell us more about this. What does it exactly mean?
Well, the concept would allow the state to impose restrictions and or obligations to public use of land.
Okay.
So basically, it's an effort to put an end to excessive real estate speculation, which has been a very huge problem in Korea for quite some time. And as you can imagine, it's also becoming a huge part of the discussion as well, because many people would sympathize with the issue of ending real estate speculation, but it can also draw up the issue of it might be abridging a person's right for private property.
Some say it's a state intervention in private ownership.
Exactly.
And some are also saying that it makes the grounds for the government to impose higher taxes on land development, including reconstruction projects. So
and that's where it comes with the whole debate between big government and small government, prevailing in any other countries as well.
I mean, Minji, it seems that opposition parties, again, wouldn't approve of such notion.
Well, this part is expected to stir controversy among the public as well, not let alone the parties. It's been branded, as you said, by state intervention in private ownership. Now, they've raised concerns that the clarification of the public concept of land could allow the government to impose higher taxes on land development, including the reconstruction projects, like you mentioned. The main opposition party also labels it a socialist move to give more power over land ownership and the economy over to the government. And they're saying we're stepping back from liberal democracy and a market economy to, and the Moon administration is promoting socialism.
So now, besides all the content of the revision proposal, another area of dispute has been when to hold a referendum on all this. So now the dice has been thrown, and where do you see this going with the parliament?
Well, the government and the ruling Democratic Party of Korea want to hold it on June 13th in tandem with local elections. Now, they say not only will it save costs, but it will also bump up the voting turnout because more people will want to vote, have a say on the constitutional amendment rather than just the local elections. So the ruling party wants this scenario to reach a parliamentary consensus by April. But the legal ultimatum the rival parties have is May 4th, because if we calculate backwards, it initially requires 18 days of notice before a referendum is taken place and 20 days after the parties submit their own bill. So that's 38 days all in all.
Okay.
So as long as parties have an agreement by May 4th, they can achieve the June 13th deadline. But the main opposition Liberty Korea party controls over 39% of the parliament. And as we said earlier, it requires 2/3 support in order to pass. So at this point, we can say it's very hard whether it will pass or not, because the main opposition party wants it done by October. So a referendum in October. Now, because it requires 2/3 of 290 among the 293 lawmakers, that means 195 votes need to be in favor.
195 votes, okay.
That's
in favor, okay.
But the Liberty Korea party holds 116 seats, so almost 40%. Now, the three major parties met today and agreed that they will kickstart negotiations again. So, because parties have agreed that the parliament has to be at the forefront of amending the constitution.
Now, surely the presidential office should be aware of the National Assembly's attitude toward this revision bill, because we did hear from a lot of experts that they don't really expect this to go through. So, I mean, tell us more about the process here and out.
And that's why the president keeps saying this is the public's will. This is the public's demand. He's been very adamant about the proposal for a constitutional change has to be made either by the government or by the parliament by the end of March, because he said it's absolutely necessary for, as Minji said, for the referendum to happen in tandem of the local elections. And there's a little bit more reason to that.
Okay.
It's not just what the president wants, but he's also thinking about extra costs. So unless it actually happens on the same day as a local election, we predict about $110 million will take place in extra costs. So that's one of the reasons why he ordered the Blue House's government's proposal to be submitted today and actually give at least 60 days to the parliament to actually review it and vote on it. And as I said before, the Blue House has urged time and time again to the National Assembly to comply with the people's demands, fully review and discuss the government's bill, and if necessary, the parliament should propose its own government bill as well. And further on, for smooth negotiation to happen, it's likely a senior presidential secretary for political affairs, Han Byung-do, to visit the National Assembly frequently this coming month.
Well, there seems to be a lot of options there, but still the ball is now thrown in the National Assembly's court. So we'll see how things go from here on out. Thank you so much, guys, for coming in today.
Well, thank you for having us.
And that brings us to the end of our show, but stay tuned to Arirang for more news updates throughout the day. As always, thank you for watching and goodbye.
Imshil, Jeollabuk-do province is famous for its cheese. In Imshil, there's a place named Osumyeon, which basically means the tree of a dog. How did a village end up being named the tree of a dog? According to the Bohanjip, a book written by the Korea scholar Cheja,